She called me on a Tuesday evening, which should have been my first warning. Nadia never called on Tuesdays. That was the night she took her pottery class at the community center on Bloor, the one she'd been doing since before we even met. If she was calling on a Tuesday, she'd either drop the class or something had shifted in her world so much that old schedules no longer held. I was in my kitchen in Oakville, reheating leftover butter chicken from the weekend, staring out at the backyard where the last of the October leaves had piled up against the fence. I hadn't raked them. I kept meaning to, and every morning I'd look out and think, maybe this afternoon, and then afternoon would come and I'd find another reason not to. My name is Daniel Hartwell. I'm 41 years old, and I work as a structural engineer for a mid-size firm downtown. I've lived in the same house for 6 years. The house I bought, thinking it would be the house we grew old in, the house where we'd argue about paint colors and whether the deck needed replacing, and whose turn it was to call the plumber. That never happened. Nadia and I separated 3 years ago and finalized the divorce about 14 months after that. The house stayed mine because she didn't want it. She said she needed a fresh start, which I understood, even if understanding it didn't make it hurt any less. I almost didn't pick up. The chicken was bubbling in the pot, and I had a report due by Thursday, and honestly, my first instinct when I saw her name on the screen was to let it ring through to voicemail and deal with it later, but something made me answer. Maybe it was the Tuesday thing. Maybe some part of me already knew. "Daniel," she said. Just my name. The way she said it, quieter than usual, slightly careful, told me everything and nothing at the same time. "Hey," I said. "What's going on?" There was a pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but 2 seconds is a long time when you're waiting for someone to say something. "I need to tell you something, and I didn't want you to hear it from someone else first." I turned the burner off. Nadia and I met at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, one of those rubber chicken dinner events where you're seated next to strangers and expected to make conversation for 3 hours. She was there with a colleague from her firm, a landscape architecture company in Liberty Village, and I was there because my boss at the time was on the board, and everyone in the office was expected to buy a table. We ended up seated across from each other, by pure luck, or by whatever you want to call it. She was funny in a way I wasn't expecting. Not performing funny, not trying too hard funny, but the kind of funny where she'd say something quiet and a little dry, and you'd think about it for a second before you started laughing. She talked with her hands. She had strong opinions about transit infrastructure, which I respected enormously. By the end of the evening, I'd found every excuse I could to keep the conversation going, and when people started pulling on their coats, she looked at me and said, "There's a bar 2 blocks from here that has decent whiskey, if you're not in a hurry." I was not in a hurry. We dated for almost 2 years before we got engaged. We were married in September, at a small winery outside Niagara-on-the-Lake with about 60 people, and a ceremony that her mother cried through from the 3rd sentence onwards. For 4 years we were good. We were genuinely good. I believed in what we had in a way I hadn't believed in much before. Then things started shifting, and the shifting was so gradual I almost didn't notice until we were already somewhere unfamiliar. Nadia had always been driven. That was one of the things I loved about her. But around year 4, the drive became something different, more consuming, less joyful. She started working weekends more regularly. She took on a major commercial project that pulled her in directions I couldn't always follow. She made friends at work I never really met, started having conversations about her professional life that I sat at the edge of without quite understanding how to enter. I told myself it was a phase. I told myself she was figuring something out and I should give her room. What I should have done, and what I didn't do, was say, "Hey, I feel like I'm losing you. Can we talk about it?" I said it once about 9 months before she left. She said I was overthinking it. I accepted that, because it was easier than pushing, and because I wanted to believe her. She moved out on a gray Saturday in March. She took the coffee maker, the good cast iron pan, her grandmother's clock from the living room wall, and about a third of the books. She left the dining table, most of the furniture, and the mug with the chipped handle that she'd bought at a garage sale in Parkdale, the summer we started dating. It was cream-colored with a thick stripe of dark blue around the rim, slightly uneven, the kind of mug that was clearly made by hand. I used to tease her about it. It didn't match anything else we owned, and one of the handles was slightly lopsided. She said that was the point. After she left, I kept using it. Not sentimentally, I told myself. It was just a mug. It held coffee. That was its job. But every morning I filled it and I thought about the garage sale and the August heat and the way she'd held it up and said, "This one," with complete certainty, like there was no other possible choice. On the phone that Tuesday, she told me she was getting married. His name was Trevor. He'd been a client at first, a commercial developer she'd worked with on a mixed-use project in Mississauga. They'd been together about a year and a half. The wedding was planned for the following June, somewhere in the Muskokas, outdoors if the weather held. She wanted me to know before the formal announcement went out, before mutual friends started asking me if I'd heard. "Thank you for telling me," I said, which was the right thing to say, and I meant it, and also I was standing in my kitchen with the cold butter chicken on the stove and a muscle in my shoulders had gone completely rigid. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Of course," I said. "Genuinely, I hope you're happy, Nadia." "I am," she said. And then quieter, "Daniel, are you actually okay? You can tell me." I almost said something honest. I came close enough that I had to take a breath and remind myself of the geometry of the situation. She was calling to share good and she had moved on. She was being kind by telling me herself, and the kindest thing I could do was not make that call harder than it needed to be. "I'm good," I said. "Really. Congratulations." We stayed on the phone for another 10 minutes, filling the silence with small updates about nothing important. Then we said goodbye the way you do when you've shared 8 years of your life with someone and ended up on opposite sides of a conversation like this one, carefully, warmly, with a restraint that cost something. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a while. Then I picked up the mug with the chipped handle, filled it with the last of the coffee that had been sitting in the pot for hours, and stood at the window looking at the pile of leaves against the fence. I thought, I need to rake those leaves. I thought, I should have said more, years ago, while there was still time to say it. 3 weeks after the phone call, on a Friday afternoon in early November, I was leaving the office when I got a text from a number I didn't immediately recognize. Then I read the name she'd signed it with, and my stomach dropped 2 floors. "Hi. I know this is out of the blue. I'm in Oakville until Sunday visiting my sister. Would you be open to grabbing a coffee?" Nadia. I read it 3 times. Then I typed, "Sure, Saturday morning works," and I sent it before I could talk myself out of it. I spent most of Saturday morning telling myself it was just coffee. 2 people who used to be married catching up over coffee, which happened all the time, which was a perfectly normal adult thing to do, which meant absolutely nothing beyond the fact that we were both capable of behaving like mature human beings. I was at the cafe on Lakeshore 15 minutes early. I ordered a black coffee and sat at a table by the window and watched the November lake through the glass, that specific shade of gray-green it gets in autumn when the light flattens out and the water looks like brushed metal. She arrived in a dark green coat I didn't recognize. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, cut just below her jaw. She looked good. She looked like herself, which was the part that always got me. I'd spent 3 years building some separate mental image of her, someone I used to know who was now an abstraction, and then there she was in a green coat, looking exactly like Nadia, and all the careful distance I'd constructed just dissolved. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I said. We ordered, we sat. For the first 20 minutes it was careful and light. Her sister's new baby, my firm's project in Burlington, the Jays, the Leafs, the fact that winter was coming early this year and everyone in Ontario had thoughts about it. She laughed at something I said and I forgot for a second what year it was. Then she wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the table. "I wanted to see you," she said, "before June, before everything becomes official and, I don't know, before it feels harder to do this." Which was true. "Are you actually?" She looked up. "You don't have to be polite." "I'm not being polite. I'm glad you're here." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone walked past with a dog that stopped and pressed its nose against the glass, and we both looked at it, and it gave us both a reason to exhale. "I've been thinking about us lately," she's not in I'm not trying to complicate anything. I've been thinking about what went wrong, and I realized I never really said some things I should have said. "Like what?" She looked at me the way she used to when she was working something out and wasn't quite ready to say it yet. "Like that I'm sorry I let things drift as far as they did before I said anything. I kept thinking I was going through something and I'd come out the other side and everything would resettle. And instead I kept moving, and you were still there, and I didn't know how to come back to where you were. I didn't say anything. I don't know if you wanted more from me. I suspect you did. You were always better at waiting than I was." "Maybe I waited too long," I said. She tilted her head. What do you mean? I mean I should have said something earlier. Instead of waiting for you to resettle, I should have knocked on that door instead of standing outside it. She looked at me for a long time. Do you ever think that if we'd just talked more, actually talked, earlier? Yes, I said. I think about it more than I sh. She nodded slowly like I'd confirmed something she'd been turning over for a while. Then she said, I still have the mug. I blinked. What mug? The one from the garage sale, the blue stripe. I took it when I moved out and then I guilty about it for weeks. She smiled small and a little rueful. I still use it. Every morning. I laughed, short and slightly disbelieving. I kept it too, I mean. I have mine, you have yours. We both kept the mug. She laughed too. And for a second we were just two people laughing about a mug, which was also everything else. And the whole weight of 3 years sat right there on the table between us, manageable somehow, 'cause we were both finally looking at it. We ended up walking after. She said she needed air and I didn't have anywhere to be, so we went down to the waterfront and walked along the lakefront trail with the November wind coming off the water and both of us in our coats, hands in our pockets. She told me about Trevor. Not everything, but enough. How they'd met on the project, how she'd resisted it at first, because she was careful about those lines, how it had happened gradually in a way she hadn't planned. She said he was steady and patient and good to her. She said it like she was reminding herself of something. I listened. I didn't ask questions I didn't want the answers to. At some point she said, you never dated anyone, did you? After, I went on some dates, but not anyone serious. No, she was quiet. That's my fault. It's really not, I said. I just wasn't ready. And then I was ready, and I was busy. And then I told myself I was busy when maybe I just wasn't trying hard enough. I worry I took something from you, she said. That's actually why I wanted to see you. Not just to apologize. I wanted to know you were okay, that you'd built something. I thought about the house, the unraked leaves, the leftover butter chicken, the mug. I'm okay, I said, which wasn't the same as saying I'd built something, but it was true, as far as it went. She stopped walking and turned to face the lake. The water was almost completely still. Somewhere far out, a container ship was moving so slowly it looked stationary. Can I ask you something, she said. Okay. She turned to look at me. Come to the house with me. My sister's not home until this evening. I want to show you something. A photo I found when I was going through some boxes. Of us. I think it's one you'd want. I looked at her. That's all, she said. I promise. I just don't want to leave without giving it to you. Her sister's place was a semi-detached on a quiet street not far from downtown Oakville, renovated, warm, the kind of house that's been lived in and thought about. She let us in and went straight to the kitchen, put the kettle on. I stood in the hallway and looked at her sister's family photos on the wall, the new baby, a trip somewhere with mountains, a birthday party. She came back with a cardboard shoebox, the kind you use for keeping things you don't know what else to do with. She set it on the kitchen table and lifted the lid. Inside, a few birthday cards, a ribbon from a race she ran in 2018, a postcard from somewhere in Nova Scotia, and underneath all of it, a photograph. She handed it to me. It was from the winery, our wedding, not a professional photo, somebody's phone probably, slightly blurry, taken from an angle. We were standing just outside the barn where the reception was, not looking at the camera, looking at each other, laughing at something. My jacket was half off one shoulder. Her hair was coming loose. We looked completely unself-conscious, like nobody was watching, like we had all the time in the world. I don't remember who took it. I don't remember what we were laughing about. I looked at it for a long time. I thought you'd want it, she said. Yeah, I said. Yeah, I do. The kettle clicked off. She poured the tea without asking if I wanted any, the way she always used to, and set a mug in front of me, a plain white one, nothing special. I almost said something. I didn't. We sat at her sister's kitchen table and drank tea and didn't say very much. And outside the November light was already going flat and gray, the afternoon running out, and I knew she had somewhere to be later and I had a drive back and a weekend at home, and none of it felt pressing. The photo sat on the table between us. Eventually she said, I hope you find someone, Daniel. I mean that I know you do. Someone who makes you want to rake the leaves. I looked up. What? I drove past your house this morning, she said, and she looked faintly embarrassed, which was unusual for her. On the way to my sister's, I used to love that backyard in autumn. I didn't know what to say to that. I sat with it. I'll rake them this weekend, I said finally. She smiled. Good. I drove home as the sun went down behind the escarpment, and the sky turned the specific orange-pink that only happens in Ontario in November, too brief and too vivid, gone before you can finish looking at it. I sat in the car in the driveway for a while. I thought about the photo. I thought about what she'd said. I kept moving, and you were still there and I didn't know how to come back. I thought about the garage sale mug, hers on a shelf in her apartment, mine in the cabinet above the stove. Two objects from the same afternoon 8 years ago now living in separate houses like we did. I thought about the question she'd asked on the waterfront. Do you ever think that if we'd just talked more? The answer was yes. I thought about it all the time. I thought about the night I almost said, "Hey, I feel like I'm losing you," and instead said nothing and went to bed. I thought about all the evenings I told myself she just needed space, needed to figure something out, needed room, and how none of that was wrong exactly, but none of it was the whole truth either. The truth was I was afraid of what she'd say if I pushed. The truth was I made peace with the distance instead of crossing it, and by the time I understood that, she was already somewhere I couldn't reach. What I didn't know then, what I understand a little better now, is that love doesn't fail all at once. It fails in small increments, in the moments when you choose not to say the thing that needs to be said, in the silences that could have been conversations, in the distance you accept when you should be closing it. I got out of the car. The October leaves were still piled against the fence. I stood there in the driveway in the dark and the cold and I looked at them. Then I went inside, got the rake from the garage and went back out. I raked the leaves in the dark. It took almost 2 hours. I got about halfway through and my shoulders ached and my breath was coming out in clouds, and the street was completely quiet, just the sound of the rake moving through the dry leaves, and I kept going. I didn't stop until the lawn was clear. I went inside. I washed my hands. I put the kettle on. I opened the cabinet above the stove and took out the mug with the blue stripe around the rim. The one that didn't match anything. The one that was slightly lopsided. The one I'd been using every morning for 3 years and telling myself it was just a mug. I filled it with tea and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard. The lawn was clear. Bare, actually. Just the dead grass and the dark soil, the fence posts, the bare maple at the back that would be green again in April. It looked strange after all those weeks of leaves piled up, a little exposed, a little open. I thought about what it would take, not to win back what was gone, because that wasn't the right way to think about it, but to stop letting the leaves pile up. To say the thing earlier. To cross the distance instead of making peace with it. To be the kind of person, when someone I cared about was drifting, who knocked on the door. The photo was in my jacket pocket. I'd have to find somewhere to put it. Somewhere I'd see it, not as a wound, but as a reminder of something true, that we were genuinely happy once, and that I'm capable of that, and that the reason it ended didn't have to be the blueprint for everything that came after. I stood there with my tea for a long time. Outside, the maple tree was bare and still against the November sky, and somewhere across the city, Nadia was having dinner with her sister and the new baby, and Trevor was probably texting her to check in, and the wedding was 7 months away, and none of that was mine anymore. But the mug was warm in my hands, and the lawn was clear, and somewhere in the space between what was over and what hadn't started yet, I thought, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's exactly where you have to begin.